In the autumn of 1382, as the last harvest was gathered and the first frost touched the fields of a small English village, the church bells began to ring. Not the usual call to morning prayer, but something deeper, more solemn, the call to Hallowtide. For young Thomas, the baker's son, this was the most mysterious and wonderful time of the year. As shadows lengthened on October 31st, his family joined their neighbors in the ancient ritual of All Hallows Eve. The village church glowed with countless candles, their flames dancing like prayers made visible. Thomas watched as his grandmother knelt before the altar, whispering the names of loved ones long departed. Her own mother, her brother who died of fever, neighbors claimed by plague. "Why do we fast today, grandmother?" Thomas whispered as his stomach growled. "Because tomorrow we feast," she replied, her weathered hands steady on her prayer beads. "But first, we prepare our hearts to remember." As darkness fell, the villagers walked slowly through the churchyard, placing flowers and small oil lamps on weathered graves. Thomas noticed how different this felt from the fear he sometimes had of the cemetery. Here, surrounded by the gentle murmur of prayers and the warm glow of lights, death seemed not like an ending, but like a doorway his loved ones had simply passed through ahead of him. The next morning, All Saints' Day, the church was transformed. Gone were the somber colors of the vigil. Now, everything blazed with gold and white. Mass bells rang out in triumph as Father William recounted the stories. Saint Margaret, who stood firm against persecution. Saint Nicholas, who gave his wealth to the poor. Saint Bridget, who turned her convent into a beacon of learning. But he also spoke of the unnamed saints, the faithful baker who fed the hungry, the midwife who comforted the dying, the child who shared her bread with beggars. "These too are among the great cloud of witnesses," Father William proclaimed, and Thomas felt a stirring in his chest as if he were connected to something vast and glorious. That evening, the village gathered for the feast his grandmother had promised. Even the most venerable oaken tables creaked under roasted meat, fresh bread, and honeyed ale. But this was no ordinary meal. Between each course, someone would stand and tell a story. How old Martin, the wheelwright, had taught half the village to read. How young Mary had nursed her neighbors through the sweating sickness. How the merchant Willem had forgiven the debts of those who couldn't pay. Then came November 2nd, All Souls' Day. The mood grew gentle and reflective as families returned to the churchyard, this time bringing the special soul cakes Thomas's mother had baked. Some cakes they shared with the poor children who came souling at their door, asking for prayers and alms. Others they left at gravesides, trusting that somehow, in ways they couldn't understand, this material sign of their love meant something in the realm of the spiritual as they looked toward the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. But if young Thomas could step into our world today, he might be puzzled by what he found. Christians often shrink from a Halloween that appears full of the demonic. They're so afraid of worshiping saints that they struggle to even name one. And if you talk with almost anyone about the past, whether personal traumas or group wounds, you'll quickly reveal walls they've put up to protect themselves from it. As our story suggests, this wasn't always so. Our ancestors, whatever the mistakes of their own times, rarely made this particular mistake of our time, to think that they could lean well into a present and a future with no notion of what to do with the past. To think that they could craft a bespoke identity from their own desires and inclinations without a connection to those who'd gone before them. In this episode, we'll take on one of the 10 commandments that's rarely discussed, the command to honor your father and mother. And we might find along the way that a big scary word, tradition, holds a healing key to many of our deepest wounds. Welcome to the Imagination Redeemed podcast, where we follow the great stories further up and further in pursuit of the life of Christ. Welcome to Imagination Redeemed, everyone. I'm Brian Brown, joined today by Jeremiah England and Sarah Howell. Welcome, guys.
Hello.
It's time. It is time to have the Halloween episode. But because we are never content to just wrestle with a controversial topic by itself, we decided we would throw in extra controversial theology, extra controversial history, and have a little bit of extra fun with it. So let's just start with this before we kind of map out where we're going with this episode. What is it about the past, the dead, tradition? Why are we so afraid of these things? And what is so hard about them?
I like thinking about being stuck in the past as being stuck in that finite space where it's kind of the opposite of the already but not yet. It's the inverse if you get stuck in the past because the resurrection of the dead hasn't come. I often think that the word or the term the past literally seems to be used today to mean things that need to be left behind. And so like
Yes.
I've often heard Philippians 3:10 through 15 being mentioned for this kind of idea where Paul says, the one thing I do, forgetting what is behind and straining towards to what is ahead. And it's our job to take what is good and literally leave the past behind us.
It can be a real danger too of, living and being unable to escape the past and unable to escape, your loss. I really like the scene in Harry Potter where he's sitting in front of the mirror and he sees his parents and he just wants to sit there forever. And Dumbledore even comes in and warns him, is like, hey, stronger people than you have been caught into this web of, dwelling on the past.
Yeah, and it seems like that's true of both the corporate past and the individual past. So I can think about it in terms of my legitimate trauma or horrible experiences. And there's that end of it where on the one hand, I can get so wrapped up in it, that it just kind of dominates my present, or I can just shove it all down and pretend it's not there. And then those seem to be the two options with things about the corporate past too. So we can forget it, pretend it doesn't exist, or we can be so obsessed with that wrong thing that somebody associated with my race, my national identity, my church, whatever, somebody did wrong 100 years ago, 500 years ago, that I'm constantly bringing it into the conversation today. And sometimes that's done in a healthy way, but often it's not. So you kind of end up with these two groups. You end up with, in the case of, I think of American Protestants, for example, I mean, I had an education that was very attentive to history, especially American history. But a lot of the people that I knew that could quote you the Declaration of Independence off the top of their head, their narrative for church history was kind of like the Book of Acts, Martin Luther, and me, and not a lot in between.
I wonder how much our inability to understand the resurrection of the dead and the life to come and how the past relates to that and matters for that is tied up in some of our kind of Gnostic ideas, or to say more simply, our lack of understanding of where physicality and the body fits into that narrative for the here and now. Because even if you think about things like the popular book, The Body Keeps Score, there's a very real way where our bodies hold memory, and the past does matter to how God has made us and how we exist in the world today. But we almost want to cut that off and just think about the spirit.
I was just going to say too, I think that, at least in the United States, in my experience, the kind of modern Protestant Christian culture in the US has a real aversion, I think, to anything that's older than a couple hundred years ago, because at least the way it was presented to me, it was very much kind of like there was this blanket period of the Dark Ages, Middle Ages, that was all kind of the Roman Catholic Church selling indulgences and only speaking in Latin so that no one could understand them, and almost like a manipulation, and we'll send these people to die in the Crusades. And it was very much like the church got corrupted and was bad for 1800 years until, Billy Graham figured it out in the, in the 60s or whatever,
Yeah. And anything unique to either Protestantism or sort of our chapter in American Christianity of any stripe is layered on top of an America that has kind of always been built on building new things. And then for the last 115 years or so, there's been an intentionally progressive layer to a lot of it, which really saw the past in general and sort of parochial traditions in general, the shackles to be thrown off. And I think that's in a lot of our psyche as well. So you've got, okay, lots of different pieces related to the past that can be difficult, either in a corporate sense or an individual sense. And then there's sort of death as a thing, which can be held up as sort of synonymous with the past, because you look at the past and you see dead people. And then there's, as you said, Jeremiah, the fear of death. But I think also in our time and place, we're not just scared of death ourselves. We are deeply uncomfortable with death as a thing. We don't see it nearly as often as our ancestors did firsthand. And we try to keep it as far off as we can, right? We bury our dead far away in cemeteries that we rarely, if ever, visit, as opposed to in the churchyard that we visit every week, every day, or we opt for cremation more often than burial. Even just when we try to talk about death, there's a lot of theological sort of weirdness that we get into. You hear phrases like, he's an angel now, or we can't seem to decide if the dead are, quote unquote, looking down on us. You don't hear a lot of sermons on what happens after you die and how to wrestle with it and how to grieve. And that whole realm, that whole territory is challenging in its own right, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
Hmm.
It's a pretty much like one of the greatest villain motivations, right? Like I was thinking about like Voldemort, Voldemort in Harry Potter with his Horcruxes, right? Or Frankenstein creating his monster. And, in Frankenstein, the book is basically all about how if you try to cheat death, you're going to end up killing the people around you and, you know, inevitably dying early yourself because of what you've tried to do, like the hubris of playing God. Lord of the Rings has the elves seeing that their magic is dying and desperate for a way out. They, forge the rings of power and end up, creating great evil in the world that ends up killing many of them in the process. And it's such a bizarre thing that as Christians, we are supposed to and can have the opposite reaction, like just kind of a ludicrous reaction to death, which is hope, right?
It is. And so in the face of that, Halloween invades. What were your childhood experiences with Halloween, and how was it explained to you what you were supposed to do with that?
Well, I grew up in the late 80s, early 90s, and Halloween was strictly forbidden in my house. It was a demonic holiday. It was a holiday of Satan, and basically all forms of celebration or participation in it was decidedly unchristian. And, you could maybe go to like a fall festival at your church that was a few days before or after that they kind of plugged in there as like a consolation prize for all of us kids that wanted candy and to dress up and everything like that.
I sympathize with your dad, Jeremiah, because like my parents were also in that vein. And I really do respect my parents for how much they took seriously the spiritual realities and powers and dominions that war against each other, right? We do not war against flesh and blood, powers and principalities that rule the air. And so, something that I feel like we haven't connected yet in this conversation are these three desperate things: the spiritual world and the evil darkness that death reigns over, or is kind of the mechanism of death. And so those two things go together in that way. We're scared of death because we're also scared of the power that comes with the one who holds death. And then there's also the body. Where does the body fit into all of this? And I think it's particularly interesting that like the grotesque and gruesome aspects of Halloween or the demonic generally have the like physical deterioration, but with a present and active evil spirit present, right? And that's super scary because we don't like the physical, we don't like to think about death, and then we also don't like to think about the power that's present with the one who is the Grim Reaper, right? So to speak. And so, I don't know, I can sympathize a lot.
Sure.
Yeah. And have you guys, I don't know what it's like where you guys have lived over the last few years, but at least in Colorado Springs, it has seemed like Halloween has kind of risen in popularity to the point where I would say just driving around my neighborhood, it's probably the holiday people get most into, at least as a visible thing. People still put out Christmas lights and decorations at Christmas time. Some of them still put out flags for the 4th of July, but Halloween probably beats both for the amount of work people put into decorating their houses and whatnot, and the things they decorate with are generally not cute and charming.
Yeah, I mean, I think modern Halloween is absolutely a festival about fear and death, right? You're either, scary costumes, right? Ghost stories, haunted houses, scary movies type of thing, right? Or, we've got zombies and skeletons and all these other kind of icons of death. I do think it's important to kind of see how we got here culturally as far as our celebration of Halloween, because I do think that, if you look at videos of Halloween from the 1940s or whatever, it is quite a bit different than our celebrations today. And honestly, I think our celebrations today are different than they were 20 years ago. But in the like 70s, 80s, 90s, there was famously the Satanic Panic, where it was kind of like culturally, the kind of more conservative, Christian movement in the United States was very much like, oh my gosh, rock and roll music. Ozzy Osbourne is biting a bat on stage, and we got, Marilyn Manson and Dungeons and Dragons and, Magic the Gathering and all these, like things. And they're, very much like, oh, these are, demonic. And so people are like, oh wow, we're freaking out the squares. Let's, lean into it artistically and make, our demons bigger and our, album covers more grotesque. And there was like this kind of weird arms race, I think, that kind of culminated in the late 90s and then became a parody of itself, and then no one took it seriously anymore, and it's different. But I think a lot of our kind of Halloween celebrations are still sort of part of that, where you're kind of seeing people that are still trying to be like, ooh, I can get a lot of attention by being really edgy in this way. I think that plays out a lot in Halloween, where maybe not so much in other festivals and holidays.
And
Yeah.
Jeremiah, I appreciate you bringing up the cultural aspect, and I want to bring up with it the seasonal aspect. This is a time where things are dying and things are decrepit and deteriorating, right? The leaves fall and they begin to decay, and we love the smell of it. Halloween is the season, this fall season. We're all interacting with our theology of the past and of the dead, and we
Yes.
want narrow categories where it's yes, death is bad, so don't talk about it at all. Don't look at it. Don't engage it. And I think that we do ourselves an injustice when we try to be too clean cut with our categories during the season.
Yeah, well said. Because, yeah, at some point that just puts you in the realm of either you're participating in the death worshiping or satanic thing, if it is indeed that, or you're sort of refusing to have a theology of death. You don't want a Christianity that has to deal with darkness. So with that in mind, here's what we're going to do. We are going to, first of all, do some myth busting about Halloween so that we can be clear about what we are actually talking about. Then we're going to look at the Christian tradition of Hallowtide. And finally, we are going to get very brave and explore the concept of tradition as such, as a way into a stronger theology of past, present, and future. So, okay, first of all, and we've done some of this. I think we did it last year on our Belief to See episode. We did some Halloween myth busting. So we can put up a Substack post that goes into this in more detail, but I'll just pick a few of the big ones that I see, and you guys can kind of jump in with, hey, that's not what I was taught, or anything you want to add. Myth number 1, Halloween is an ancient pagan holiday. No, it is not. Halloween, as we know it, is less than a century old and only became super popular in the last 40, 50 years, as Jeremiah referenced. There was an old Celtic harvest festival called Samhain. It's written as Samhain, but pronounced Samhain because, the Celts. But we know almost nothing about it for certain. And most quote unquote facts about it were Victorian era speculations. So that whole line of thought that Halloween originated as a pagan or satanic anything is almost total myth. We'll get into this more. We'll get into some of what Halloween originally actually was when we talk about Hallowtide. But another myth I thought was worth drawing attention to was that the spooky aesthetic means that Halloween, as we know it, celebrates evil. As you said, Sarah, autumn already naturally reminds us of death, and fear and the macabre aren't inherently evil. They're part of the human story, and they're part of how we have to wrestle with the world. But just like with horror stories as a concept, spooky things as a concept, I do think there's a place for them in a Christian imagination, because we do need stories and images that wrestle with those aspects of reality. You need a dragon in order to appreciate the knight's victory. Shane Morris did a good extended treatment of this idea a few years ago that we can link in the show notes. And he pointed out that the ghoulish aesthetic, all the skeletons and stuff, actually originally began as folk mockery of Satan and his defeated kingdom. So this is something that's like, this is nowhere in the evangelical imagination that I experienced growing up, but I think is actually something we need to recapture. There is a place in the Christian imagination for mocking death, for mocking Satan, for mocking the impotence of evil as a way of saying, no, it's not giving in to fear. It's laughing at fear on some level.
Well, yeah, I mean, the famous line, death, where is your victory? Death, where is your sting? It really is like, you can kind of read it seriously, but it's also kind of a burn, it's like a sick burn. You got nothing, buddy. And yeah, I think that's very much part of the Christian expression.
The thing that I love, my mom used to say all the time is, the Egyptian magicians really did turn their sticks into snakes, but Moses' snake, which was God's, ate them. Right? That's awesome.
Yeah, I think.
Well, and throughout Scripture, I think in our modern sort of materialistic mentality, we read a lot of those scriptures as fights between God and his people and pagans and their fake gods. I don't think that's the case a lot of the time, and that's certainly not the way that the Bible writers themselves seem to, first of all, tell the stories and then reference the stories later. They seem to think that most of the time this is actually God defeating other, lowercase g gods, like evil supernatural forces that have set themselves up against him. And there is often evil power shown in Scripture, and yes, defeated.
And we're getting off of the myths for a second, Brian, but this is just again a reiteration of the theology of the past. Do you think that the Jewish writers of age old had any worthwhile thought? Or do we just go, oh, tut tut, they didn't understand how the world works, and they thought that there were all these powers that didn't exist, and they're just fables and old stories that don't matter, as stories don't matter.
All right, here's another one. Christians should avoid anything with pagan overtones. That's another thing I'm going to say is a myth, because I think it abandons too much ground to Satan. It basically says the minute something starts to smack of anything other than happy clappy, it belongs to Satan. I'm not here for that.
I agree. If you read, books kind of a couple hundred years ago, their approach to death is very different than today. I think we're just so scared of it because we've been so, isolated from it, and we've been sterilized from it. We don't look at it. We don't think about it. We don't talk about it. And even with our kids, like I've, wondered with my children and had discussions with my wife, because it's like, well, when do you talk about death with your kids? When do you show them movies that maybe talk about death? And it's like, almost this thing of, oh, we don't want to scar them. We don't want to hurt them by even bringing the subject up. But yet maybe we're missing a lot because of that.
Yeah, I mean, typically the early church had this kind of this less baptize or burn approach when it came to things they found in the world that predated Christianity. If it was truth, if something was true, they would accept it or complete it. And where they saw things that could be redeemed, they would go for that and do that. And they were constantly in the business of transforming pagan symbols and practices into symbols of Christ's victory. I think that's a quote from Peter Leithart that's stuck in my head over the years.
Yeah, but Brian, too, to your point of letting the domain of darkness take too much ground, as if their ground is theirs anyway. This is our Father's world. And if we understand and zoom out to the true story that's happening here, I kind of don't like the term pagan overtones. What about just
Yeah.
lived experiences from humans? And if humans are made in the image of God and they're seeking truth, I mean, Paul's sermon in Acts at the, how do you say that Athenian place?
The Areopagus.
Yes, the Areopagus. The Lord's kingdom is literally everywhere and in everything true. So
Yeah, we can there's a place for not participating in something that truly is evil or gives the association with evil. But overall, an approach to the world that is based on fear is not a Christian one.
Yeah, it reminds me of like the old Larry Norman Christian rock song where he said, "Why should the devil have all the good music?" He was trying to do rock music back at the same time as Black Sabbath and, Metallica and all these, bands that, again, were very much trying to, freak people out and get attention by putting, satanic symbols on their albums. So, obviously there was a lot of real criticism and concern from the church about rock music. And his whole thing was he was saying, as an artistic form of expression, rock music, all forms of music was created by God. And, if all artistic expression and musical talent originally originated from God, how can it be fundamentally itself demonic?
Probably where I hesitate a little bit in that train of thought is that I do think forms matter.
but Brian, can I jump in real fast and defend a specific form of music we're talking about, which is so tangential to our conversation, but I
Yeah,
do
go
think
for it.
it matters. I very much have I have strong convictions about this because my brothers grew up during a time where like heavy metal and like metalcore
Sure.
was a really big deal, and I used to call them little demons. They were like the high pitched demon and the low demon, and they were like terrifying to me. But then, like, talk about Christian baptism. There were these Christian bands that utilized that form and expression to unveil, that kind of apocalyptic way of spiritual warfare, and had these amazing songs that I still find to be some of the most worshipful experiences I've had listening to a conversation between the devil and God, and how
Mm.
God comes over it, and his power is so much more and so much greater. And I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it, right? Like in almost every form of the way that we interact with nature and creation, with our own subcreation, there are ways for us to bring God as the true Lord over the form. And so, yes, I understand what you're saying, but I think that it's even nuanced in your argument as well.
Yeah, I think well said. I think probably the place where I would try to create a hopefully useful principle for people is, option one is, yeah, you sort of give the devil way too much ground. Option two is you say forms don't matter. So in church, out of church, context agnostic. We just sort of use whatever makes us feel good wherever, and only the substance of the lyrics matters. And I think what we're probably both more happy with is, artistically speaking, intentional attention to artistic forms and genres, and how do you use what's there? Can you bless, baptize, don't go straight to burn, but how can you pay attention to forms and use them well in the service of both the art and the larger spiritual goals? I would love to have a lot more Christian artists and a lot more Christian church people, pastors, everything, way more literate in that whole space, because I think what we ended up with was more form agnostic, certainly form agnostic Christian worship, where we just didn't pay attention to it at all.
I totally agree. I think that's really well said.
All right, well, we got to move on from our myth busting. We could do more, but we'll put the rest on Substack. The big picture that I want to make sure to reiterate is, no, historically speaking, Halloween has little to no basis in pagan anything. Most of the contemporary Halloween customs came up, actually, some of them came up in response to a little trend of kind of mid to late century trend of vandalism, and we're actually supposed to be a pushback against that. And hey, let's make it a night where it's safe for kids to go outside and do something generative and useful and healthy instead of that. And then, yeah, modern commercialized Halloween, however, whatever might be going on in the culture or the souls of people who are, yeah, going healthy or unhealthy directions. Modern commercialized Halloween isn't real Halloween any more than modern commercialized Christmas is real Christmas. And Christians looking at it and saying that it is, it's no more useful doing that than it is abandoning Christmas because oops, Hallmark got it.
Yeah, I think, Halloween actually can afford a lot of really good opportunities as Christians. I know my wife, she grew up in her household, they celebrated All Saints Day instead of, Halloween. And, her brothers and sisters would dress up as Bible characters and they would try to guess it, and they, hide candy around the house. And they try to basically kind of teach a little bit of the actual origin of Halloween, and also, make it a little bit more biblical centered while bringing in some fun, cultural festivities and practices that, I think they all really enjoyed. My wife talks about it very fondly. And I think, however, you and your family choose to celebrate it, I think at the very least, there is some opportunity to use Halloween as a holiday, as a, a specific time to remember or reflect on certain things, whether it's, the saints that have gone before us, whether it's, reflecting about death and its very real presence and what it means for us as Christians and the hope that we have through it. And it can also be, a time of celebrating fall and celebrating, the moment of abundance right before death that we have. That's kind of built into our natural cycle of things. And, I think that there can definitely be ways to celebrate and experience the theater and the food and the traditions and things of Halloween in a way that that is good and nourishing for the soul.
Well, let's talk about what we have to play with in doing that, because I'll be a little bit of a Grinch and say that I think that the whole harvest festival thing that churches do is lame. And here's why. It's the same as when we say that there are a whole bunch of words that we have artificially designated as profanity, but we're going to make up almost identical words and say that those are fine.
Right.
Right. It's like, oh, no, we can't do Halloween, but we know it's really fun and we know there's nothing intrinsically harmful in it. So we will do literally the exact same thing at our church, but you can't dress up as a skeleton.
It's like all those shirts that drive me crazy where it's basically just a popular brand, but they just awkwardly shove in a Christian phrase and put it in the Coca-Cola font or something like that, where it's
right.
like, well, I want to wear like the stylish clothes, but, I can't participate in the materialism of the world. Therefore, I will just slap Jesus on there like a big sticker so I can still wear the fashionable trend.
And
It's
participate
honestly
in the materialism of the world.
Yeah, exactly. At best, it's just blatant copyright theft.
My gosh, let's just remember that phrase
theft
for all time. Yes, as a principle, when you as a Christian are wrestling with how to engage with culture, blatant copyright theft is not the answer. But what we can do with this is actually really the same thing that we try to do with Christmas, which is look back beyond the modern commercial silliness and ask, well, what was this? What was this supposed to be? And it is worth then looking at, there is an actual Christian tradition. So modern Halloween is not an adaptation of an old pagan thing. It is exactly like with Christmas. It is a commercialization and simplification of an old Christian thing called Hallowtide, which was a 3-day festival. Some of the reformers didn't like the third day as much because it was a little purgatory focused, but they at least hung on to the first two. And it's worth just talking for a minute about how that actually worked. Actually, the best summary that I've seen, I saw on Twitter, on X of all places. A guy named Michael Frost explained it this way. The day after Halloween is All Saints Day. So on Halloween, or All Hallows Eve, because it's the eve of Hallowtide, we say to death, we're not afraid of you. And on All Saints Day, we say, see, all these people weren't afraid of death either. That's the best little 2-sentence summary that I've encountered.
That's
So
beautiful.
Hallowtide was this 3-day festival, also called All Hallowtide, or the autumnal Triduum, which was a 3-day observance spanning October 1st, November 1st, November 2nd. And the name came from 3 Old English words: hallow, meaning saint or holy; tide, meaning time or season; and all, meaning every. So All Hallowtide is all holy season. So you have All Hallows Eve, Halloween; All Saints' Day or All Hallows' Day; and All Souls' Day. So the original one, which originated in the 4th century, was All Saints' Day. Originally, it was a feast honoring Christian martyrs, and it kind of bounced around. Different popes put it on different dates, and November 1st became the official date in the 8th century, and then Pope Gregory IV made it a universal observance in 837. That's quite a ways back for those keeping score at home, the Christian thing. So that's All Saints' Day, and it kind of evolved. It started as a day to honor those who had died for their faith, and it evolved into something that was an opportunity to simply remember all of the Christian dead who had gone before, particularly the ones particularly worth remembering, the heroes of the faith, so to speak. Halloween just kind of naturally developed as the vigil, the evening preparation before All Saints' Day, just like Christmas Eve precedes Christmas. So just like in our story at the beginning, you fast in order to feast. And so that became a day of fasting and prayer and preparation for it. And for those of you who are into the concept of thin spaces, Christians often believed that the veil between the earthly and spiritual realms was thinner on that day. But it was a time for spiritual reflection on mortality and the brevity of earthly life as we know it. Again, something that we're not terribly good at anymore, actually just pausing. Kind of like we do with Ash Wednesday: to dust you are, and to dust you shall return.
One thing that I think is just so beautiful about, and this is true for Ash Wednesday, which we're not talking about right now, but the vigil and the fasting, it is this time to prepare yourself to remember. And if we think about just like the literal word to remember, is in this moment where we're thinking about death, as we prepare ourselves to really meet with these ideas that are hard for us because we are in the already and not yet. We have this hope as we wake up and we celebrate All Saints' Day to remember the body of Christ, those that have come before us and where we are now, that there is not a distinct separation between those who are in Christ Jesus, but the great cloud of witnesses and the heroes that have come before us are there. And so, like, whether you believe in thin spaces or not, what a delight.
Yeah.
What beautiful light in the midst of such darkness as the fall starts to come and take away the amount of sunlight during the day. I just think that that's so beautiful, and how you kind of need that vigil in the beginning to prepare yourselves and slow down and to do that work of remembering, because we so often are stuck within what's happening here and now.
Yeah. And as one of my pastors once put it, death sucks. So it's a big deal that death is defeated. And it's worth meditating on that.
Yeah. I think it's interesting too, like you said, that the day after the All Saints' Day is, the day that you kind of remember, oh, these people, they went through death and it was okay for them. They made it through, and they not only did it well, but we can remember their great acts of charity and faithfulness and generosity and overcoming adversity, and, be inspired by their stories. Because, no one wants to die alone, right? That's the ultimate fear. And as Christians, we never will, because we have those who came before us. It's that whole picture of the great cloud of witnesses as you're running through the stadium and the finish line is right there, and you go through, I got through the finish line, and everyone, woo, we made it, type of thing, rather than the world's version, which is this cold and lonely place where it's just darkness afterwards. It's just nothing. You're met with nothing. It's empty. But for Christians, it's the complete opposite. You have a stadium full of people cheering you on as you take that final step.
And those people cheering you on, Jeremiah, Brian, you're the one who kind of alerted me to this. I've never thought of it this way before, but those people in the stadium are your family. They're your spiritual mothers and fathers. And oh my gosh, the delight of having your parents be proud of you, the saints that have come before us, and to consider honoring your father and mother, one of the 10 laws, the 10 commandments, to be something that requires communal participation. This isn't just nuclear family, honor your father and mother, but it's the whole body of Christ, all the mothers and fathers, all the ways that we are related as a family, to honor and to requires us all to be participatory in it, right? Because you have to have a daughter to be a mother. You have to have that mother has a mother, right? We all have these familial connections, and it's so wonderful to think about how time does not separate us in this moment of All Saints Day, but in fact, we all get to come together, remember, and honor the things that God has done for us, the communal us.
Yeah,
It's interesting. Maybe this is a bit of a stretch, but the verse in the Ten Commandments where it talks about honoring your father and mother, it actually does specifically deal with life and death. It says, the whole verse is, honor your father and mother that you may live long in the land that God has prepared for you. And, I think there is something to that, remembering and honoring and I guess taking seriously and paying attention to your father and mother. And I think also by extension, your grandfather and grandmother and all the way back, it is a way to enrich your life and make your time of living here longer. And I think it's also a responsibility as parents too, to give that sort of pass down that inheritance and knowledge so that your children can live long and prosperously in the land that God has prepared for them.
And it's beautiful, I think, the spiritual and physical ramifications, right? We do all have physical mothers and fathers, and we get to practice honoring them. But also, we all have spiritual mothers and fathers who have walked us into the faith. And so the great command to have dominion and be fruitful and multiply isn't merely a physical one, but it is of procreation. But it's also to have the light and the glory of God go out through all the nations.
Yeah, this whole picture that you've painted is one of a corporate identity, because Christianity is a corporate identity. And we talked about this in our episode on the lost tools of singing and we songs, this idea that you're connected. It's not just, Christianity isn't just this individual connection vertically with God. It is that, but it's also a horizontal connection with people on either side of you, and a chronological connection, not just with people before you, but with people after you. And all of that means something. So we didn't talk about the third day, All Souls Day, which is historically was more focused on prayers for the dead in purgatory, and has had a couple of sort of Protestantized iterations for some of the Protestant traditions have gotten into. But All Hallows Eve and All Saints Day are the things that are most commonly practiced across Christian traditions in the West. But I think what you just said, Sarah, is a perfect transition to why all of this adds up to something, why this concept of honor your father and mother is different from simply children obey your parents. It'd be kind of weird if it was just, if one of the 10 commandments was devoted to, don't be rude to your parents, little 4-year-old. But as Jeremiah pointed out, Paul says it's the first commandment with a promise that you may live long. And why is there a connect? First of all, why is it in the 10 commandments? Second of all, why is there this connection between honoring your father and mother and prosperity, flourishing?
And specifically living long, the cheating death. You want to cheat death, don't build Frankenstein, just honor your father and mother, I guess.
It reminds me of the Andrew Peterson song, You'll Find Your Way, which is one of my favorite songs. And there's a line about, if love is what you're looking for, if redemption is what you're looking for, keep to the old roads, follow the ancient paths. This idea that you don't follow your heart, don't make it up as you go, you don't have to. It's this song of comfort. You don't have to. You're going to grow up. You're going to get lost. But go back to the ancient paths, lash your heart to the ancient mast. I was excited to do an episode where we talked about this, because sometimes I will have conversations with people, including listeners, who see the Anselm Society as a call to bring creativity back into the church. And it's not less than that. But if we think of creativity merely as kind of creative self-expression and individuality, and the church is too repressive and that sort of thing, then we're not getting the whole picture. And tradition is a very useful kind of corrective to some of the ways that we go crazy. And by tradition, I don't mean necessarily the Roman Catholic understanding of tradition, which is wrapped up in the magisterium, the idea of the sort of legal authority of the church. I'm talking about sort of lowercase t tradition. So we should probably start out by me explaining what I mean by that, and then we can get into it. What we tend to think of when we hear tradition, I mean, first of all, we nearly always seem to bundle it as a word with dusty tradition or dead tradition, or these negative terms. We tend to think of tradition as weird, primitive superstitions that some jerk is asking me to submit my life to without regard for my taste and preferences. Or at best, that cute little harmless thing we do at Christmas time.
Both are horrible.
Yeah, right. And there's sort of an assumption as well, I think, that I'm the first person to have ever questioned it. It's this old thing, and people back then, whenever back then was, were so stupid they didn't see how stupid it was. But I'm enlightened. It's like I'm a big fan of the Die Hard movies, and Die Hard 4, John McClane turns on Creedence Clearwater Revival, and the younger guy in his car says, "Oh my gosh, this is horrible." Like, what's the matter? It's classic rock. It's old rock. If it sucked then, it still sucks now. And
I'm glad you could baptize those, Brian. So,
yeah, we have to.
Creedence Clearwater Revival and Die Hard movies officially approved by the Anselm Society.
And also, Die Hard is a Christmas movie.
Honestly, whenever I hear the word tradition, maybe just because I grew up in theater and did this play, but I always think of Fiddle on the Roof. I think it's a great art about tradition. And, like that's the whole premise of the movie, is that, it's our traditions that ground us. And without our traditions, we'd be as shaky as a fiddler on the roof, and basically then the whole play is about all the traditions unraveling thread by thread by thread until they eventually lose everything with their, being kicked out of their home. And then realizing that, well, actually, all that we really have at the end is our kind of identity that's reinforced and grounded through our traditions. And, I think we have kind of like surface traditions, and then we have like the deeper meaning behind those traditions. And the deeper meaning, can be represented a lot of different ways. And it's sometimes hard to find that deeper meaning, but it's, through those things that we find it. It's interesting. One of the things that I kind of learned in being a member of the Anselm Society that I'd never understood before was, the importance of like the calendar and, special times that we basically set aside, whether it's holidays like Christmas or Easter, or, some of the more kind of obscure ones that, it's really good to have some sort of like external physical reminder that can kind of be a conduit to then get into the deeper meaning and the deeper kind of understanding of spirituality, which can be quite difficult and quite tricky to engage with.
Mm-hmm. Oh gosh, you just feel like in the last 20 seconds, you just hit on so many really important things. So I want to dig. One is the idea that tradition can contain things like the great stories and things like that, but also that those things are part of a way of acclimating yourself to reality that can't be done just through propositions.
I think that's one of the reasons that, okay, so like kind of like what you said before about, the modern church's way of celebrating Halloween is to have a harvest festival on October 29th and tell everybody, okay, you can wear costumes, but they can't be scary. They can't be skeletons, no ghouls, no death. We got to basically really sterilize it and keep all conversations about death and fear out of the celebration. And, maybe that's right, maybe it's wrong, but I do think at some point you lose the engagement with that, and that maybe there is something to kind of the theater and artistic expression of death, whether it's, grabbing your My Chemical Romance CD and putting on your black eyeliner and singing chorus to Black Parade. I don't know. But like, I think there's something to the whole idea that we have a lot of cultural and artistic touchstones throughout the last forever that deal with death. And I think people are desperately trying to understand it. And as Christians, our creativity and our art maybe shouldn't completely ignore death, and we should talk about it, and we should find ways to express it, to even again almost a celebration of death as going through that finish line and celebrating the people that have before. You're looking at the wall of trophies and you're seeing, oh man, this guy won the marathon in this year and he had this time, or this person did this amazing thing for God. Jim and Elizabeth Elliot, sacrificed their lives just for the off chance that they might get just a little bit of scripture to these people that didn't have it before. I think there's something to that. And I think that there could be something to, the Christian creative artistic expression of death and our wrestling of it, and that just because we do have a character in a story, like Voldemort, let's use as an example, right? Pretty evil guy. Everything about him is wrong, right? But you can read those books with a deeper meaning and understanding what it means to, split your soul as a cost to try to cheat death, and how that, is often expressed almost in a real way, but you're, hard to kind of understand and grasp what that means,
And it's done. I mean, every generation in the last few hundred years, we've had some kind of usually technological attempt to cheat death.
Something I was thinking about, I had, when I was in youth group in high school, one time our youth pastor was like, I think this is probably going to be really cheesy. None of you are going to like it, but we're just like all going to get in our vans and we're driving to a cemetery. And we went and drove to the cemetery and we just sat in a cemetery for like 45 minutes and had this time of reflection. He was like, I just want us all to like just think and talk about death for an hour.
Wow.
It was honestly one of the most meaningful and memorable experiences I had in youth group, because I had never had anyone really talk to me about death and given me the opportunity to talk about death, because it had always had been such a, very sterile thing. Whenever it was talked about in the church, it was very much, oh yeah, Christ defeated death, woohoo, type of thing, but very much like it's, but to actually like sit there and think about, in Ecclesiastes, what does it mean when he says that all of life is futile and we're all just going to die in the end and it's going to be meaningless, and it's like some of those concepts are very tricky and worth, as a Christian and in the Christian, environment, engaging.
First of all, Jeremiah, you had a great youth group leader. Second of all, I remember a similar experience. I was an adult, but I went to an older cemetery in Pennsylvania, and it was on this sort of rolling hillside, lots of trees that had been there a long time. A lot of people had been buried there in times when perhaps people thought a little differently about death than they do now. And I don't think anyone had ever explained to me why Christians bury their dead. Most pagan traditions burn their dead. The reason that Christians bury their dead is because of what they believe is because of what they believe about what happens when you die. They believe that death is a temporary splitting of your soul from your body. You are not a soul that is walking around in a body. You are an embodied soul. You are both spirit and matter. Death is the splitting of those two things. And so the huge irony in what Voldemort tries to do is he literally tries to defeat death by committing death to himself, by splitting his soul from his body. And it looked like a city of the dead, the cemetery. It looked like a city of the faithful. All the graves were pointing east, because that's what you do, that you bury your dead facing Jerusalem as a sign of faith in the resurrection of the dead on the return of Christ. So it looked like the city of the dead awaiting the return of their king, much like Aragorn does with the paths of the dead, calling them forward to fulfill their oath. It was this goosebumpy experience, and it matters how we view that. Not because God can't work with a corpse that's been burned, but because we believe these things about the nature of death. And our future is not that the bodies go wherever and the souls are the future. No, the future is the souls reunited with their bodies.
The one thing that I want to locate for us in this conversation, and I'm having a hard time placing it, is this concept of repetition in tradition.
Mm,
Repetition can carry a lot of weight and connotation to the very term itself, just like the word the
yeah.
past. I often think of repetition in this kind of manipulative, hypnotic tactic. Like, oh, if I just continually do this, then I'm going to convince myself of some reality, and with a negative connotation to it. Like the power of repetition slants negatively. But then there's also this another negative connotation of repetition being, well, if I didn't get it right the first time, then I have to do it again. Or if it didn't fully sink in, then I failed in some way and I have to do it again.
Responding to your sixth altar call.
Yes, yes. So what is it about repetition in tradition, right? We do this every year. We bury every dead person facing east. Yeah, I'm just curious, what are the positives um to
We need to be reminded. I mean, we're all a little ADD, and it's if you want to memorize something, if you want to really take it into your heart, you have to say it over and over and over and over and over again. Doing something once is very forgettable. I homeschool my kids, and so a lot of what I'm doing is like helping them memorize and study for tests and things like that. And um, I always describe it as you're like beating a path through the woods, right? If you walk through the woods one time, it's all meaningless, right? You do it 4, 5, 6 times, maybe you get a little bit something, right? But if you walk the same path in the woods 50 times, you're eventually going to beat a path through it. And you still have to walk it every once in a while or it becomes overgrown. And so it takes, a habitual rewalking of that path for you to be able to get from point A to point B in an easy, straightforward way.
Yeah.
And that's what tradition does, right?
Yep. Yeah, tradition is and you can think about traditions in terms of that aspect of it, kind of the ritual aspect of it. You do that with anything that really matters to you. My trainer will talk for as long as anyone will listen about how not only do workout routines obviously strengthen your muscles, they also rewire your neural pathways so that your body does things correctly, instinctively. Whether you're an athlete or not, you want to be strong enough to do the difficult thing. And to some extent, for the difficult thing to be easy at the crunch time.
right. But so help me out here though. There is a way that we, I think rightly, can be concerned that we will create neural pathways with things by brute repetition that are false or unhelpful or unnecessary. So how do we kind of parse through the past, uh,
Yeah.
parse through what tradition should and will be? And how could we have confidence in the customs and beliefs that have been transmitted down to us through church history?
Yep. Yeah. Well, one other thought on the ritual thing, and then I'll back up from there to that excellent question. I think I would frame ritual like ritual isn't performance, and it isn't shallow, and it isn't nothing. It's formation. It's not done separate from doctrine. Good rituals are repetitive things, right? If you use the word habit instead of ritual, all of a sudden all the scariness goes out of it, right? Like how many habits do you either have or wish you had in order to kind of drill into your head over time and help you, like Jeremiah said, remember something that really matters to you? Well, of course, you would want those things built around important truths, things that are actually real. But the modern dismissal of ritual as superstition or, we're beyond that is actually a very dated Enlightenment idea that's been pretty thoroughly debunked by modern cognitive science. Ritual's I think it was John Vervaeke that said, ritual is a sophisticated cognitive technology that helps us engage with aspects of reality that our minds can't grasp just through ideas and propositions. So if that's the case, and we want it to be, we're sort of willing to say, okay, yeah, if hypothetically there were some practice that improved my prayer life or helped me understand a difficult concept about God better, like the Trinity, that I just have trouble wrapping my head around when someone tries to explain it to me. Well, okay, whose authority am I trusting on that tradition? And that's, yeah, your $1 million question. At the end of the day, you live in 21st century America, and there's quite the buffet table of options, and there's no way around the fact that you have to navigate that. And I'm not saying this is easy, but over time, one of the things that I've come to believe is that when you kind of diss a tradition that goes back maybe all the way back, like 2,000 years, you're basically saying you are smarter than everyone before you combined. You're not saying, like the diehard guy, it's old, therefore it's good. You're saying it's old and it has survived the most brilliant minds of Christendom for 2,000 years trying to think of something better and trying to challenge it. And they have wrestled and wrestled and wrestled with all the most important things over and over and over and over. Everything's been visited and revisited, and not only have things been challenged, but new depths of meaning have been discovered as things worked on grandfathers and fathers and children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So you're sort of saying, I'm smarter than all of those people combined. I remember a cartoon I saw when I think it was when I was a kid, that was this sort of flow chart of Jesus to all these different branching schismatic groups over time. And somebody, the teacher, is pointing to something way, 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 way down the line and saying, and this is where so-and-so came along and we finally got it right. Yeah, Jesus is so lucky to have us. For thousands of years, Christians got it wrong, but now we have it all figured out. Jesus is so lucky to have us. Okay, well, at that point, you're not Martin Luther, you're Joseph Smith. Like, you're a Mormon or something. You're saying that, yes, I enter the great story as a participant, not an onlooker, but I get to kind of make up what that means based on how I read a 2,000-year-old text. Whereas literally the most direct intermediate connection that God gives us to how to encounter him in relationship and respect his authority is honor your father and mother, which is the most concrete example of submitting to the traditions of men that I can think of.
Submission and honor isn't necessarily blind obedience, right? Like Edmund Burke says that reason is kind of like this way that we place the centuries under our eye. And that's not to say that we lift ourselves out of history and make up something new or innovate and say we have the understanding, but it is this humble submission of our eye to surveying the history, as Chesterton says, the democracy of the dead, all of the people that have come before and what they've said and how they've wrestled, and that you get to be a part of that as opposed to standing over it. So
I think I was just going to say, kind of going back to your original question, Sarah, I think that, the main thing is to really understand, take the responsibility and do the homework of understanding the traditions and why you're doing a certain thing. Because I think maybe to go in the other direction, there can be some danger in tradition, because traditions and habit is a good way of controlling a large group of people. It is kind of almost a form of mind control. A fighter will practice a block 50,000 times so that when the punch comes, he doesn't think about it. It just goes like that, right? But then, read the book 1984, right? They had many, many, many rituals and traditions in place that were meant to control the people. You follow these things and you do this every single day, and pretty soon it becomes normal and it becomes all you know, and you just do it instinctively do the thing that you've been trained to do.
There's a fake dichotomy, a false dichotomy, which is that the option is tradition or no tradition, and that it is even possible to just kind of make up our own version of Christianity, which is in fact the real one. No, you're just accepting, in most cases, if you say, I don't want to do tradition, I want to do Christianity. First of all, Paul makes fun of you in one of his letters. But second of all, what you're actually going to end up doing, kind of like when back in the 90s, where like everyone who wanted to rebel dressed like a goth, like, I'm going to be all individual and dress exactly the same as all the other people who want to be really individual. If you're gonna just sort of reject tradition as a thing, what you're going to end up doing is picking the flavor of the month
Mm.
thing that feels real and feels authentic and feels natural to you, and not realizing that it is itself a tradition. So the the people that I know who are most vehemently against tradition as a concept within Christianity have a whole set of terminology they use that's not in scripture, a whole set of meanings they associate with terminology in scripture, physical gestures. A lot of them are very charismatic and they raise their hands like this. The Bible doesn't tell them to do that. Where did they learn that? Aesthetic assumptions about what constitutes a church building and why, values and habits, daily devotions, not a term that is in scripture. Specific church format, 30 minutes of singing and sort of ecstatic prayer followed by a 45-minute sermon. You're still going to end up with something where you're inheriting a whole bunch of assumptions about what is this thing we call Christianity. You're just going to call it real and authentic and Christianity when it was made up in the 80s.
Tradition's baked into our DNA as humans.
And to bring it back to Halloween, even cyclically within the way that the Lord our God has made 4 seasons, we continually go back every fourth season to the fall, to November, to this time where we get to decide, to your guys' point, how are we going to go about our beliefs and what customs are we going to fall back into every November 1st? And what is the substance of our belief that that we want to dictate our custom?
Yeah. So I also shortchanged our conversation by not actually defining tradition before we got into it. I did want to make clear that we've talked about ritual a number of times, but like Jeremiah said, it's a lot bigger than that. It's the way that I would explain tradition as a thing would be tradition is a tapestry of meaning. It's the collection of stories and answers and doctrines and embodied practices that are Christianity's answer to the question, how do I become more like Christ? There are plenty of churches in the United States where those kinds of things get skipped after you convert. The accumulated wisdom of 2,000 years of our ancestors doesn't get handed to you. So it's like, oh, that's great. You converted. Here's your Bible. Join a small group. Best of luck. Or go get a master's in theology. I know people that have done that. They've gotten a master's in theology because I guess that's the only way there is to actually learn my faith. Tradition is the collection of stories and answers and embodied practices that you can kind of jump into midstream to be formed by the faith. So yeah, how do we do that with this? I mean, an easy one is, trick-or-treating itself is a modern iteration of souling, an old practice of going door to door, selling soul cakes in exchange for prayers for the dead. There are lots of ways you can take old practices like that and tell your kids a different story before you leave the house. Hey, this is a day when we remember those who've gone before us. That's part of why we dress up. We can mock death, or we can dress up as um, our heroes and remember them that way. But there's a place for actually, I think, entering into something like the current iteration of Halloween in a more Christian way. You can have a great conversation over all that candy at the end about, why is so and so your hero? What do you admire about them? What do you want to be like when you think of them? And kids always perk up when they hear grown-ups talking about that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I think it's funny. I think about like how kids still today, but I think especially used to have such a fascination with dinosaurs. And it was like, I heard once that kids learn to say these complicated names like, Tyrannosaurus Rex and Brontosaurus and Diplodocus and stuff because it almost gives them power over something that is very strong and powerful. And I think kids do want to talk about death. I think there's a innate curiosity about it. And, possibly, as you're approaching the Halloween season and you're seeing all the costumes and the ghouls and the goblins and the zombies and the skeletons and the Nightmare Before Christmas is on TV or Pixar's Coco or all these other things that as Christians we're supposed to be like, cover their eyes. Maybe those are a good reminder to have a conversation about death with your kids and maybe even a conversation about fear. I mean, how many times have you ever actually really asked your kids, what are you afraid of and what makes you afraid? And what do you think about death? And, and things like that. Like again, in the way that holidays can be our reminders to reflect and think about something, or like, Brian was saying, the church graveyard being a place that you walk through every week on your way to mass or to church, having that external reminder is maybe a good thing to bring it up. So instead of, running, screaming with your fingers in your ears, be like, hey, this is an interesting thing. Let's talk about it.
And a more specific practice along those lines, Christina had this idea one year. We only did it one year because then the next year we all got sick. But we had a number of neighborhood kids over, and we actually had a number of different adults. We kind of turned off all the lights in the house except a few candles, and we had a little pile of candy in each room with an adult. And kids would go from room to room, and in each room they would get a piece of candy, and that adult would tell them the story of a particular saint. And so we went through, we don't have a big house, but we managed, I think, 4 or 5 rooms out of it. And so they heard all these different stories. You can make your own kind of family tradition along those lines around All Hallows Eve, but you can also lean into that mentality long term and just make the stories of the faithful part of the life of your home. And this is true whether you have kids, whether you're single, whether you're empty nesters. We are stepping midstream into a story that is larger than all of us, but contains all of us. And the more familiar we are with the struggles and triumphs of the faithful before us, the less alone we will feel in that story.
Yeah, Brian, I was thinking about something my friends and I used to do when we were in college, is have like PowerPoint presentation nights where like we would all pick our most favorite thing and try to like convince the others that, for 5 minutes, this is my TED talk. And and some of them were ridiculously silly. Some people were hilarious. Some people were really serious. But to consider having with a trusted friend or a group of friends to come together in kind of a cheers and swap stories of ways that you have been greatly impacted by the love that you have seen that has been gone unnoticed by others. What a delight that would be. But then also the other thing that I thought of was C.S. Lewis's little essay at the beginning of Athanasius on the Incarnation. Generally, whichever, it's a pretty popular introduction to that book whenever you get it. And he argues that you need to read old books by dead people. And so even if you're not a reader, how cool is it? We have the Bible. It's written by a bunch of dead people. But to consider becoming acquainted with a couple of members of the democracy of the dead by reading people who are far, far away from you, time and space. And that's kind of another way I think we can kind of partake in the custom of remembering in the fall.
Yep. And not to be too on the nose, but we've designed this podcast the way we have for a reason. We want you all who listen to this to be able to encounter a hopefully often new story, either from Christian history or hagiography or mythology, or that has been created from the Christian imagination. We want every episode for you to encounter at least one of those. And then we also want you to encounter the ideas behind them. So if you listeners have questions about specific practices that you want to learn, or specific things about church history or tradition that you think are weird or want to understand better, drop them in the comments on your podcast app like Spotify, or do it on Substack. And we'd be happy to do maybe episodes on it or just address your comment. Like, we're not the be all and end all of everything, but we are well supervised theologically by our churches, and we're happy to help you find answers. Also, if you want to get into saint stories and the idea of the interconnectedness of the stories of the faith, the picture book Stories of the Saints by Carrie Wallace is gorgeous and absolutely phenomenal. It has like 30 or so, if I remember correctly, stories. And then Jonathan Pajot has a whole series of fairy tales that he's retelling and intentionally connecting with each other, so that you can see some of the threads of how Christian worldview, for lack of a better term, has actually influenced the stories, which in turn have influenced us.
Wallace book I will also highly commend, but it's so fitting to bring it here because boy, does it talk a lot about death.
I think some good verses to maybe bring up on Halloween. 1 Thessalonians 4:13 and the following verses after that basically lays it out exactly what happens after you die. And that's where the verse. It says, "Brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death, so that you will not grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope." And then it kind of lays it out. And then 1 Corinthians 15, I think, is really interesting because it's the whole idea of Paul arguing that, yes, there is a resurrection, there is something that comes after, and that it's the whole point of Christianity. Without the resurrection of the dead,
And as
Yeah.
talk about the custom, or, the great tradition and what scripture has to offer, I think of so many songs that I sing when I'm scared. No power of hell, no scheme of man can ever pluck me from his hand. Greater than is he who is in thee than he who is in the world. There's just so many beautiful songs, songs, Brian, um, that conjure up the victory over death too.
yeah, Halloween can really be an exercise of you and your kids just going, "Oh, Jesus defeated that, and Jesus defeated that, and Jesus defeated that, and we have victory over this, and we have victory over this, and this is where we have our hope." I mean, there's a lot to celebrate.
You guys have kind of inspired me. I've wanted for a long time to organize like an All Saints Day feast of some kind and just tell these kinds of stories and sing these kinds of songs and eat a lot, obviously.
Yeah,
Practice makes perfect, so get started.
Start
all
somewhere.
holidays are redeemable and can be celebrated, and you can have fun, and you can be with your community, and there is a way to do it in a way that enriches your soul and the lives of the people.
Let's not forget how amazingly communal Halloween still is in this isolated
Yeah,
world that we live in. It's not just a
Yeah.
family holiday. It's a time where we get to interact with our neighbors and teach our kids, or just even teach ourselves and practice praying for those we pass by during this night.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many of my neighbors that I only see on Halloween.
I think you have to kind of meet people where they are too, as far as, the whole idea of like, why does Christianity get boring? Well, maybe you're talking about things that people aren't thinking about, right? And so you have to kind of look, well, why does Halloween resonate with so many people? Why do we have so many movies, and the Halloween decorations are, as big as the Christmas decorations, and, the goth culture and all these things? Yeah, I mean, it's not like a small movement. People are obviously very interested in this topic, and maybe we can go and meet them where they are.
Yeah. And that's maybe a great note to end on, because all of this whole conversation is not to say that the pagan or the satanic are insignificant
Absolutely.
or yeah, or that you shouldn't think about these things, you shouldn't wrestle with these things. Rather, it's that these things are real. Demons are real. Supernatural forces are real. We are in a cosmic war for the cosmos, not just the earth. And there is a revival of interest in pagan religions. And there's honestly the death thing, horror, slasher movies. People are interested in what happens after you die. They're interested in questions about their own mortality, and they are often barking up the wrong trees looking for those answers. So ultimately, the answer to however you as a person or your church as a community might approach Halloween and All Saints Day, I think needs to be built around this fundamental idea that Christians do nobody any favors by shying away from those difficult questions or those common trends, or just by dismissing them and refusing to engage. But Christians have to show a better answer and an explanation of reality that does justice to these difficult questions and these yearnings in some cases. Sometimes that means telling people what they don't want to hear, but it might mean telling them a bigger, better, deeper, richer story, not saying none of that is real or you can become pagan by accident. We serve a real God who is Lord of everything, and we can offer everything to our neighbors this time of year. Well, guys, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Brian.
It's always a blast. And yeah, there are more Halloween myths we can bust and more thoughts on what the heck are we to do with tradition, but we will put those on our Substack. So if you are not following us on Substack, hop over there and join us. The Imagination Redeemed podcast is a production of the Anselm Society. It's easy to see this world as disenchanted and to give up hope that there's more. But you were made to see the world with the eyes of heaven and to live a bountiful life that participates in the life of God, like in the great stories. To help make this show possible, go to anselmsociety.org/podcast25 and make a donation. The Anselm Society is a place where you can come in and experience that beauty, joyful celebration, and ancient wisdom, and go out renewed, bringing that life to your vocation, home, and church. Learn more at anselmsociety.org and join us next time as we pursue a renaissance of the Christian imagination together.